Hello and good afternoon, everyone. As I've just been introduced, my name is Marley Tucker and I'm a postdoc at the Senckenberg Biodiversity and Climate Research Centre and at Goethe University. I have the pleasure of introducing the final plenary of the conference by Iain Couzin. Iain is the director of the Max Planck Institute of Ornithology and the chair of the Biodiversity and Collective Behaviour at the University of Konstanz in Germany. His research examines the principles underlying evolved collective behaviour, which he has been successfully doing for the past 20 years. He has received various awards in recognition of his research, including the Zoological Society of London Scientific Medal and the National Geographic Emerging Explorer Award. He's also had over 12,000 citations, and he's held various academic positions across the UK and US, including Oxford University and Princeton University. He uses many different biological systems to look and understand collective behaviour, including insects, fish, and primates. And sticking with the theme of the conference, which is ecology across borders, Iain's research spans many different fields of research, including behavioural ecology, evolution, physics, engineering, psychology, network theory, computer science, and computational and experimental neuroscience. His work integrates both experimental and theoretical approaches, using cutting-edge methods to answer how and why animals make movement decisions within a group context. So I'm sure we will all be in for a thrilling and fascinating journey into the world of collective behaviour. Before we start, I'd just like to point out, if anybody has any questions, please don't forget to tweet to the hashtag EAB2017. If we have time at the end, we'll go through those. So will you please join me in welcoming Iain Couzin.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And so, I'm going to talk to you about collective behavior. And ever since I was a kid, I was fascinated by these types of patterns that we see in nature. Here you see schooling fish on a coral reef, and shortly you'll see flocking birds. And what's surprising, perhaps, is that we have relatively little understanding of both how and why these unrelated organisms come together in these apparently choreographed flocks. But collective behavior is not only all around us, it's within us as well. Our body is a perfect example of a collective. And so in our department, we study the simplest animal on the planet, Placozoa, which is basically a swarm of cells. This is real data here. You can see these waves of turning, crossing, propagating across these groups. And so really, this is the sort of fundamental aspect to life on Earth, being a collective. We also study, as was mentioned in the introduction, we study insects. In particular, we study locusts. So these are vast swarms. And perhaps what's surprising about these types of groups, again, of unrelated individuals, is that they're driven by cannibalism. Everyone is trying to eat the ones ahead and trying to avoid being eaten by those behind. And the outcome looks cooperative, but it certainly is not. And arguably, the most complex organism we study are humans. This is in a main railway station in London. And unbeknown to these pedestrians, there are actors in the crowd subtly, subconsciously manipulating the crowd's behavior. But this also characterizes our approach to science, which is that we develop advanced imaging tools, in this case, just to track the motion of the pedestrians, and also to record where they're looking so we can reconstruct visual fields and communication networks, something I'll come back to later. And it's really this aspect of collective information transfer that defines these types of systems. And you can see why in the 1960s and even into the early 70s, it was believed there must be telepathy or thought transference among the individuals to choreograph this behavior. But now what we realize, largely using computational models that were developed also around the 70s and 80s, is that local interactions among these individuals can give rise to self-organization, to self-organized properties within these groups. And what I'm really fascinated by is, we know quite a lot about how the individual mind works, how the individual brain works. We know much less about what happens when brains come together via social interactions. So can we think of collective minds or collective cognition within animal groups? And what sorts of properties arise when we consider this interconnected mind concept? And we rely on using computational methods because if you look at these interactions, we can't just scale up using verbal argument alone. And so using computational models allows us to get inside the head of the individual to understand how and why it's behaving in the way it does. And so you don't need to care too much about the equations I'm going to show you. You can just think about this visually or schematically. So when individuals, such as an individual I, which has a position c at time t, they have velocities. And what they're tending to do is changing their velocities in response to neighbors, such as if they become in close proximity, they will tend to avoid collisions, which for birds in flight can even be fatal. If they become isolated from the group, they can lose the benefits of group living, and so there's a tendency to be attracted towards other individuals. And there may or may not be a tendency also to align their velocities with near neighbors. And one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, well, why does collective behavior evolve? But we can't go back in time and ask individuals just to exhibit, for example, attraction, others just to exhibit alignment, and see the fitness consequences. But what we can do, and what's shown in this video, is we can create virtual realities. So here, these little prey items look like zooplankton to the predator, a fish here, a bluegill sunfish. And you can see it targeting this lone individual. Now, those individual prey look identical. However, they have evolvable behavioral rules. And what we find by running hundreds and hundreds of fish so we can accelerate the process of evolution, what we find is it doesn't just pay to be attracted towards other individuals or just to align with other individuals. You have to balance those two tendencies. And that gives the collective a protean type of behavior, which makes it much, much harder for the predators to target. And again, as I reiterate, this is really based upon relatively local interactions around the individuals. And if we think about this now in three-dimensional space, what we find in these models, regardless of exactly how you develop them or parameterize them, this is a very robust result. You find that there exist three fundamental states of matter. So, to use an analogy in physics, if we look at the physical world, there are a multitude of ways that molecules can combine and can interact with each other. Yet, we just have solid, liquid, gas, and plasma if you play around with physics a bit. Similarly, what we predict is despite the diversity of possible interactions among individuals, we expect to find the swarm solid-like state and these two fluid-like states, the translational motion and this rotating motion, this milling. Now, there's nothing in the equations of motion that said go in a circle. This is an emergent outcome from those local rules. What the models also predict is that there should exist a form of collective memory that is independent of individual memory. And so, for example, if I speed up the individuals within the simulation and run the model for a very long time to dynamic equilibrium and then speed them up again, we follow that red curve there. And so what happens is they go to translate from the swarm state into this milling state, and finally they enter this translational motion, the polarized state. However, if I take exactly the same model and I now slightly slow individuals down and run it for a very long time and slow them down further, we don't follow back through the red path, we follow this green dotted path. They do not revisit that rotating state. This shows that the group has a memory of its previous state, even though no individuals within the group have a knowledge of that state or a memory themselves. It also shows that natural selection can't just choose a single behavioral type and you'd expect to see the same collective behavior. You can have two very different collective behaviors for identical individual interactions. Now, this is reminiscent, again, of processes in physics. So here this is liquid water, but it's cooled down close to the freezing point. Tap it on the dashboard of the car, and little imperfections within the water seed ice, and the ice spreads through the system. So for the same parameters, in this case temperature, this water could exist in the liquid or the solid form. The form it takes depends on the previous form it exhibits. And so while modeling is very useful to explore these types of ideas, in around 2008, when I was able to set up my own lab, I really wanted to explore these properties using experimental systems to try to get the same level of detail that was previously only possible in models. And we turned to small schooling fish, because as you'll see, they exhibit these dynamic properties, and we can also tag them with little fluorescent tags, as you can see in the picture, so we can know who is whom. And what we really want to do is to link together our understanding, our theoretical understanding, with empirical work. And you can see here, the very first day we got our fish into the lab, you can see them exhibiting these types of transitions. But it's difficult to record these behaviors. And so working with postdoc Haishan Wu, we developed tracking software. It took us about 8 or 9 years to develop this, that can track the motion of all of the individuals simultaneously without losing track of who is whom, even when they overlap with each other. So this is one random individual within a group of 800. And in over 100 hours of filming this species of fish in different group sizes, we've only ever seen the 3 fundamental states of matter that we had predicted. And we can define these states based upon the polarization, which is how well aligned the individuals are, and the rotation, which is analogous to angular momentum in statistical physics. And you can see here that the group spontaneously transitions dynamically between these different states. The transitional regimes are unstable. So plotting exactly the same data, this is not a simulation, this is a real fish school here, you can see these 3 hotspots that correspond to these attractors in this low-dimensional space. The low polarization and low rotation is this dense swarm-like state, and then we have the milling state and the polarized state. So one thing we can ask ourselves is what causes the group to undergo these transitions? One possibility is that the individuals change behavior, and then that behavior translates to a different collective pattern. But as you recall from the model, we can also get 2 different collective behaviors for identical individual behaviors in a so-called bistability. And we find that both processes are at work here. The transition between the swarm state and the milling and polarized states is driven just by, as the model predicted, an increase in speed. Just by adding that energy to the system spontaneously goes from disorder to local order. And if you think about it from the perspective of the animals, these states look identical. And we have no evidence that the individuals know which of these states they're in. And in fact, this relationship between speed and polarization is absolutely identical regardless of group size. So the transition between the polarized state and the milling state is just driven by stochastic fluctuations. And the group exhibits a memory of its previous state, as we predicted. But what's perhaps more important about these sudden transitions in collective state is that the group can actually exhibit multiple states at the same time. And this is going to turn out to be very important for how groups process information. And this was work done with Andrew Badal, who's now a professor at the University of Washington, and Colin Tawney, who's a lecturer at Glasgow University. And so what we've done is we've set the fish a challenge. And that is, we're sort of simulating a dappled light environment where there's a global optimum and local optima, and it's constantly changing, so they can't just find a solution and fix to it. They need to constantly explore this environment. And the fish naturally have a tendency to like to be in the dark regions, which is where they feel safe from predators. But because it's difficult to track them against the dark background, at the bottom is exactly the same experiment filmed in infrared light. And we can cut out the visible light so we can track them and look at their interactions, both with each other and with the environment. And what we found was the first experimental evidence that indeed, as group size increases, the individuals become much better at solving this problem. And so we could then turn to our experimental data and ask ourselves, well, over what range are they interacting with this environmental gradient? And over what range are they interacting with each other? Because we were thinking at the time that this must be the so-called wisdom of crowds effect. where each individual is making a local noisy estimate of the gradient, and by pooling those noisy estimates, the group has this emergent sort of capability, or this collective capability. But one of the fun things about doing experiments, of course, is that nature can often surprise you. Because while, as you see in the blue line, there's ample evidence that these social interactions are very important, the red line shows that regardless of group size, we find no evidence that the individuals themselves are capable of detecting that gradient. That is, they're not integrating either in space or in time. So this leads us to a conundrum. If the individuals are not capable of detecting the gradient, how on earth is the group able to do so? And of course, natural selection has found a beautiful, elegant, simple solution that actually turns out to be provably optimal. The individuals just take a local scalar measure of the light environment where they are, and they speed up in poor environments, light environments, and they slow down in dark environments. Now that does mean, on average, they'll spend slightly more time in the dark, regardless of being in a group or not. But as you saw from the data, it's very ineffective because there's no gradient sensing. But what happens when individuals come together is that there becomes an awareness of the environment at the collective level that does not exist at the level of the individuals, a truly emergent property that allows the groups to dynamically track these gradients. And so if you think of my hands as being two fish, and think of an elastic between them representing the interactions. If they're moving together, and then this one slows down in this dark region, and this one continues fast, that elastic is going to stretch and start exerting a centrifugal force towards the dark region. And that effect is very important. Also important is, like cars on a highway, because time to collision is what they're regulating, when they move slowly, they become more dense, and so the attraction tends to point to these dense regions. And it's those two factors that give rise to the physical intelligence of the group. Another way of thinking about it is that top part of the group is slowed down. Now, what happens when they slow down? If you remember from the previous study, when they slow down, they form a swarm, which is basically a solid. It's dense and disordered. In the light regions, where they still are moving faster, they're remaining in the liquid phase. And so this group, within the group at the same time, you've got the solidification and this liquefaction, and that is actually performing the computation that the individuals need. And working with control theorists, as I mentioned before, this turns out to be provably optimal. And it's also cognitively minimalist. And so our golden shiner fish have now inspired a generation of robots, which I'll show you shortly. But one question that you may ask yourselves, well, this sounds a bit group selection-y. The group property is being selected for. Well, it turns out that if we have completely selfish agents, they will readily evolve. This is work with Andrew Hine, who was a postdoc in my group. They will readily evolve into this specific regime that allows them to spontaneously track gradients, plus to spontaneously optimally allocate themselves among different resource patches, regardless of whether they know they exist or not. And it's all down to this physical computation. So natural selection just has to tune simple local rules to allow the collective to perform the computation. And as I mentioned, our little golden shiner fish have inspired Shinerbots, little robots that can, and the famous killerbots at Harvard, that can conduct these types of algorithms because they're cognitively minimalist. Now, I suggested that the interactions could be conceived as an elastic potential between the two individuals, and that, of course, is a simplification. And what we've also developed now to try to understand really the interactions among these individuals is software that doesn't just track their positions. It calculates the body posture, the positions of the eyes, and then uses an algorithm called raycasting to reconstruct how photons, the pathways of light, fall onto the retina of each individual. And so we can now reconstruct the visual fields of all individuals within the group. And I'm just showing you one randomly chosen individual here with the left visual field in red and the right visual field in blue. And working with Bryn Rosenthal and Colin Toomey, two graduate students in my group, we were very interested in how these networks of communication influence the propagation of behavior. So a hallmark of collective behavior is that an individual changing state can transmit that change to other individuals. And it happens very fast in the case of an alarm response like this. This is a slow motion movie. And if we developed a way that we can trigger any individual in the group to exhibit this reflex alarm response, and then we can record how it propagates through the group in 205 experiments where we know the initiator of the event, which you can't do if you sort of drop something in the water or you wave at the fish, because then multiple individuals can see that information. And what we find here is that most of the time there isn't much response. But sometimes you get these large cascades propagating across the group. So a priori, it's very difficult to know why. It's the same stimulus, one individual exhibiting an alarm. And you can see this is a log-log axis, so it's a very long-tailed distribution. And what we needed to do is to establish the functional mapping between the sensory input and the decision-making at the level of the individuals. And this is actually very hard to do. And all animals have to do this. Now, I'm talking about visual information, but we could think about multimodal information, we could think about acoustics or smell. But what organisms have to face is the challenge of having this complex world in which we live, like the complex scene I'm seeing in front of me, and to translate that complexity, so-called high-dimensional sensory input, via the brain into low-dimensional behavioral output. And in the case of this alarm response, it's predominantly driven just by two cells called mouth nerve cells, two giant neurons. So it's really a perfect dimensionality reduction that we can investigate to understand how does the brain do this. And I won't go into the details here, but it really relied on this computational visual field reconstruction and body posture mapping for us to really understand how the input is shaped. And then we use modern techniques in machine learning to infer how the individuals translate this. I won't go into the details because I don't think that's particularly important here, but it turns out that the two visual features the fish use are the two simplest features they possibly could use. They are not using derivatives, like rates of change. They're just using two very simple features. We think because it's very robust in sort of unclear environments, for example. And now that we understand what features they're paying attention to and how that's translated into behavior, we can construct a network where the edges between the individuals represent quantitative probabilities. What's the probability of you changing state if I change state, and vice versa? So it's not like what people mostly do in social network research, which is if individuals are close, you consider them to be connected. This is a quantitative predictive network based explicitly on the visual information they use and how the brain computes. And even though they use the simplest possible visual features, this network is complex. It is weighted and it's directed. I might be strongly influenced by you, but you not by me. And this is common in biological networks, yet rarely considered. And so we can begin to ask ourselves, what is the relationship between the network structure? I find these we call these the hidden networks of communication, because of course, if you're trying to understand how the individual brain works, you can go in and look at the circuits that give rise to individual behavior. Well, this is the circuit that gives rise to collective behavior. And we can begin to understand how these circuits are structured, because these fish are under immense selection pressure, 92% mortality per year at this age. And so we can ask, how is the network structure related to the spread of behavior? Now, if you look at the literature, it is often assumed, almost exclusively assumed, in fact, that the most influential individuals are those with many connections, a so-called high degree, to use the network literature term, and whose neighbors have a low cliquishness, or a low clustering coefficient, again to use network terminology. Now, why is this assumed? This is assumed because it makes intuitive sense. And this is true of spread of disease. And there's a huge literature on disease spread, a tiny literature really on the spread of behaviors. And so if I'm infectious with a transmissible disease, I don't believe I am, but if I were, the more people I connect to, the more people I communicate with, probabilistically, the higher is the probability that I will infect you. But if I infect the individual, say, at the front row here, and they're friends with each other, but they don't want to talk to the rest of you, the riffraff, I can infect them, but because they're a clique, it's not going to spread. And so this makes intuitive sense. And people make this assumption when they model social behaviors. But we can now ask, for the first time, is this actually true? We can ask it of the real system. And it turns out, is this actually the case? Well, no. It turns out that the most socially influential individuals, the so-called super spreaders of behavioral contagion, are those with a low degree and whose neighbors have a high clustering coefficient, exactly the opposite of intuition and the opposite of what is assumed in almost every model of social contagion. But importantly, because this is a real system and not a model, we can ask, why is this the case? And it turns out to be predominantly because social contagion is a so-called complex contagious process. So returning to the analogy of disease, I described to you how I could infect other individuals. Now let's say I now have a political view, say about Donald Trump. I might try and convince you of my political view, but I could spend all day trying to convince you, and you're not convinced. Donald Trump's too polarizing. Say I have a sudden political opinion that's not quite as polarizing. I may convince you a little bit, but you haven't changed your belief. You haven't changed your behavioral state. But then maybe I convince you, and then he convinces you, and then later on you talk, and then you're convinced. So I've influenced you both directly and indirectly through these loops. And so what organisms do, this is true of humans, of birds, and of fish that we've studied, is that they are seeking reinforcement from multiple sources. In fact, they do something quite clever. They look for information in different parts of the visual field. If they're correlated in space, then they discount it. And so they're acting very much as do coincidence detectors in neural networks for the same reason. And so using this new understanding of the relationship between network structure and the spread, this complex, stochastic, real biological system, which before, as I mentioned to you, we trigger an individual and we don't know if it's going to lead to nothing or an avalanche of behavior change across the group, suddenly becomes deterministic and highly predictable. So we can run a new set of experiments where we freeze time at the moment of initiation, we reconstruct this network, and we predict who is going to change behavior when and how it's going to spread, and you can see we can predict extremely well how this works. Now, one of the big problems with studying collective behaviors, one of the challenges, and why it took us so long to conduct that previous study, is that causality is very hard to infer beyond the first responder, because you don't know how individuals are integrating information from multiple sources. We don't have control over causality, and even using information theory approaches, we find we cannot really understand causal influence. And so what we've done to address this is develop a holographic virtual reality for freely moving animals, whereby we can have photorealistic organisms interacting in the same tank with the real animals. And of course, we can control these virtual organisms. So how do we do this? This sounds a bit science fiction-y, doesn't it? It's like the holodeck. So we use an illusion. Now, you see those three objects at the front there? You see these as physical objects in three-dimensional space. Every single one of you does. And we have a very complex brain. You can go in here, and your brain fully believes this to be a Rubik's Cube. But it's not. This is an illusion. And you'll see the illusion broken in just a moment. So it was correct only from that specific perspective. As soon as you change perspective, this poor person would have to print out lots of sheets of paper from the different perspectives to keep fooling you. But we can run this illusion in a computer. And so we can immerse these real photorealistic objects. This, again, is not a real object, not a real three-dimensional object. And so if it works so well for us, surely it will work pretty well for fish. Another way of thinking about this is here you see a typical so-called three-dimensional image of a computer screen, which is not 3D at all. But if you track the head, the camera in this case, you can actually move in behind those objects. They now have a volume both within the screen and outside the screen. So it's called an anamorphic illusion. And so using this illusion, we can have a real zebrafish at the top there and a virtual zebrafish below it. We can project this onto a dome-like tank, and now we can put objects, this is sped up, we can put objects into the tank that aren't really there. So this pillar doesn't exist, but it's projected as if it exists. So that's why the projection looks weird because we're projecting it from the perspective of the fish, taking into account distortion of the bull, and the animal will avoid it. And so we've created, at the top there, you can see a real juvenile zebrafish. At the bottom, in D, you see a virtual zebrafish, which matches the same body posture changes over time. This is our virtual fish here. And so now, for the first time, we can have real and virtual animals interacting in three-dimensional space. And so you can probably see which one here is the virtual fish and which one is the real fish. And I've deliberately put this simple example in so you can see that difference. But of course, we can control this virtual fish in any way we like. And we have 6 of these systems. We can interconnect them together. So each individual can interact with virtual replicas of other individuals, plus real virtual, completely virtual individuals, or computer-generated individuals. So now you see 2 fish interacting in the same holographic space, even though they're not together. And so we can then, of course, control, because we're networking these systems, we can put in temporal lags, we can control these properties, and we can put multiple individuals in the same environment. We could have virtual predators. I mean, it's just up to your imagination. This is the video game engine that we use. You can put anything in here. So this is the sort of future of where we're going. And I just wanted to mention that because I think this is going to be a real breakthrough technology for understanding social behaviors. Okay, in the last part of my talk, I want to talk about leadership and collective decision-making within animal groups, and how groups make informed decisions, consensus decisions. And I'm going to start with some pretty old work first, because it sets the scene for some very recent experimental tests. And so again, I'm showing pictures of fish because I like fish, but you can think of any organism here. This is a really generic model. I'll show you later results from other species. And so this individual has goal-oriented behavior. It knows, for example, that there's a food source over there that the others don't know about. Or perhaps it sees a predator over here that the others haven't seen and wants to move away. So we can just define a very simple model whereby individuals have to reconcile this goal-oriented behavior with their social behavior. Now, does this individual who has knowledge need to signal to others, I know what's going on, follow me? Do individuals need to be able to recognize who has information and who does not? Well, we have no evidence that they do. And so we start with a very simple computational model where the informed individuals are going to be colored in bright colors so we can see who they are. But in the model, there's no ability to infer the state of other individuals. Of course, you could put that into the model, but as I said, for many systems, we've got no evidence that they can do that. So the colors are simply for us. They start at random positions, random orientations. You don't know if anyone agrees or disagrees with you within the group. And the informed individuals are assumed to balance their social tendency with their goal-oriented tendency with a weighting term that we call omega. Now, if omega is very small, the individuals don't want to risk leaving the group, and so this vector doesn't play much role, and omega, of course, can become large. And if it becomes too large, the individuals could even leave the group. Now, I'll come back to the strength of omega in a moment, but first I want to ask, can information be transferred among individuals with no signaling and no individual recognition? And so I'm going to set a preferred direction for these informed individuals, and I'm going to have 1, 5, or 10 informed individuals in a group of 100. And the green cross just shows you the centroid of the group. Now, 1 informed individual isn't able to guide the group. But 5 informed individuals, after an initial period where they occupy the frontal edge of the group, they do convey information, albeit not very accurately, but they're kind of moving in that preferred direction. But if we look at 10 informed individuals, suddenly and near spontaneously, they convey the information very accurately, and the group moves in this preferred direction. Now, we can quantify this accuracy from 0, which is no information transfer, to 1, which is perfect information transfer. And I should note that these are stochastic models. These are noisy individuals. They make errors. So we never get to 1. But you can see as the proportion of informed individuals increases, the information transfer accuracy increases asymptotically for all group sizes. But if we look at different group sizes for a moment here, and we choose, say, 85% accuracy, for a small group, like a group of 10, we need around half of the individuals to have information. But as groups get larger and larger, such as a group of 200 in this example, we now need less than 5% of the individuals to have information. If we simulate migratory groups, we've done models of evolution of migration, we can have an infinitesimal proportion of individuals that actually know where to go, and yet it looks like everybody does. We've also simulated cell sheets, and the same holds. And we can test these ideas in different experimental systems, such as our schooling fish. The red ones are informed that when a green laser stimulus goes off, that they associate that with reward. Naturally, they have no response to this green laser. And you can see that wave of information propagating across the group and this accuracy that we'd predicted. More recently, we've taken this concept into the field, and we've been studying white storks using solar-powered GPS and accelerometry data. So these are real animals in the field. And again, we have very, very consistent leader-follower behaviors. But here it's kind of interesting because we can start looking at the costs and benefits. The leaders have a cost because they need to find thermals, and we can quantify this cost in their search efficiency. However, and then the followers just come in when the thermal is found, and it's much easier for them. But the leaders can really exploit the full potential of the thermal before they leave. The followers are forced to leave a bit later. And so there's a frequency dependence going on here. But what about if there are differences in experience and motivation? What about if there are individuals that have a conflict about where to go? Can groups come to a collective consensus? Now, if we do this, if we're all going to go to the same pub tonight, and I'd ask you which ones we should go to, and some of you have one opinion, others have another opinion, and others don't know the town, so you have no opinion, I would ask the question, you'd maybe put your hands up, I'd do a calculation and pass back the answer. But of course, these animals cannot compute in this way. And what turns out to be important is the number of individuals with these preferences, the strength of those preferences, but also the geometry of the problem. And so I'm going to fix one informed subset who always want to go along that preferred direction of 0 degrees, and I'm going to start creating a conflict and have another subset that either agrees with them, so they also prefer 0 degrees, or they prefer a different angle, such as 10, 20, all the way up to 180 degrees, where they actually want to go in exactly opposite directions. And that's reflected by the upper dotted line. And so for each angular difference, I run thousands of simulations, and we find where the group goes. And for simplicity, I also show you the average. Of course, the animals can't compute this average, but it's there for a reason, because if we have 5 that want to go one way and 5 that want to go another way in our group of 100, we see that below a critical difference of opinion, the group will split the difference and spontaneously move in the average direction. But above that, this is not the group splitting. This is half of the time one group wins out, and half of the time the other group wins out, and they go in the other direction. And so to show this visually, below this critical angle, the group will spontaneously adopt the average direction. And imagine they're going towards a red and a green target. The closer you get to those targets, this angle is going to get larger and larger, and suddenly they will enter the consensus regime, and in the consensus regime, they'll randomly choose either this way or this way. So they spontaneously go from averaging to consensus. So now I can add one extra individual into the group. So instead of 5 versus 5, we now have 6 versus 5. Random positions, random starting conditions, and yet now what we see is that when they enter the consensus regime, 98% of the time, the majority wins out, even though the individuals don't know if anyone agrees with them or not, even though they cannot count. It's the fluidity of motion of the group that is acting like a computer. It's a collective computation. And so, like before, if there are 2 differing opinions, but they're not so great, then the group will average. But now when we reach the bifurcation, they will almost always choose the majority preferred direction. And here's the simulation running, where there's now 10 individuals that want to get to the white and 10 to the red. The green are uninformed, and it's going to be random which one they choose. But if I add just one extra white individual into the group, and you can see the local noisy nature of the interactions, even in the movie, the group will collectively compute the majority. Now, they do enter a regime if the omegas are very large and they're unwilling to give up on their preferences. You do enter a regime where the group can no longer come to consensus and will now tend to split. And of course, the green ones could learn about the red target and so on, and so you can have a more complex, dynamical fission-fusion type population. Now, I got interested in this problem again because it always kind of bothered me. Like, if there's this kind of arms race, if being strongly opinionated allows you to get your own way, why don't individuals just, exert that opinion on others? There are many cases, such as in human societies, where there are differing opinions within a group. But if you can't come to consensus, such as about choosing a candidate for a job, then this could damage the organization. And individuals, of course, could lose the fitness benefits of being in a group. So now I'm going to talk about these conflicting interests a little bit more. And so if we have a majority versus a minority, what's to stop that minority from just becoming more strongly opinionated? Can they get their own way if they do so? Well, it turns out the exact numbers don't matter, but if we have a majority of 6 versus a minority of 5, and I fix the majority preference to be 0.3, if the minority also has that same preference of 0.3, as I showed you before, the majority will win 100% of the time, probability 1. But as the minority become more strongly opinionated, their omegas get larger, those vectors become larger, you can see that they can begin to influence the group. 0.5 is half of the time the minority wins, and half of the time the majority wins. But if the omega gets strong enough, you can see now the minority get their own way, and they dictate the motion of the group. So it seems that becoming more opinionated, more strongly opinionated, is a good thing for you. It can exert a stronger influence on others. But this is the case where everybody in the group has a preference. In many cases, there are going to be individuals within a group who either don't know what's going on, or they know perfectly well what's going on, but they don't care which way they go. And it's always been assumed that having these uninformed individuals would just act as a source of noise. They wouldn't change much else. But now what I'm going to show you is the role of these uninformed individuals. And on the x-axis here, I'm showing you the percentage of uninformed individuals in a group. Now, the minority has a stronger preference than the majority, 0.38 to 0.3, but it's not so strong. In fact, with no uninformed individuals, the majority still wins around 60% of the time. But look what happens if I put in 10 or 15 stupid individuals. They push the majority further. Now, if everybody is uninformed, of course, the group can no longer make good decisions. And I can increase the minority preference further and further still. Now the minority, they're so strongly opinionated, they'll win about 98, 99% of the time. But if I put in 10 or 12 individuals that don't care, they spontaneously push control back to the majority. So they stop the strength of preferences from mattering. And it comes down to effectively a democratic vote, even though, of course, the individuals aren't knowledgeable that they're doing this. And we've been able to prove this result mathematically. I won't take you into the details there, but we can create a network model where we can actually prove this result. And we've shown this in models of coupled oscillators, even in models of physical spin systems like magnets. This holds. It seems to be a very general phenomenon, yet it had never been discovered. And this small proportion of unbiased or uninformed individuals, they really do some remarkable things. They massively increase the probability of reaching consensus. They act like a social glue that prevents the extreme opinions from not being able to see eye to eye. They massively increase the speed of reaching consensus. In fact, the exact proportion that democratizes the group maximally also minimizes the time taken to take decisions, which is very interesting that it's exactly the same point. And they make decisions more accurate. But of course, I'm a biologist. I'm not really going to believe any of this stuff unless we can test it experimentally. And we have this prediction that uninformed or unbiased individuals should inhibit the influence of a strongly opinionated minority and spontaneously return control to the majority. And so turning to our little golden shiner fish, working with postdoc Christos Wanu, who's now a lecturer at Bristol University. Christos, by the way, was completely blind to the predictions of the model. He had no idea what I was working on. He was completely blind to that because I didn't want an unexpected bias in his results. And so he trained individuals to a yellow target or a blue target. And fish have an intrinsic color-based learning bias. That means for the same amount of training, they have a stronger preference for yellow, a stronger omega. So we can have our minority of strongly opinionated individuals and a majority of less strongly opinionated individuals. And our model predicts that this should occur, this transition from minority to majority control should occur for a relatively small number of uninformed individuals within the group. And you can see here in our experiment, the strongly opinionated minority do dominate decision-making when there are no uninformed individuals. But just as we'd expected, if we put in 5 or 10 uninformed individuals, we spontaneously reverse the consensus. and now the majority dominates. We've also, so really it's the diversity of opinions, especially having individuals with weak opinions, that democratizes these decision-making processes. And it turns a very potentially complex scenario into a simple dynamical system. And these model results, as I mentioned before, we find them across a whole swathe of different systems, from neural dynamics to social dynamics. And so we should expect to find this in other systems too. And so we turned to a classic hierarchical system of baboons, and this is work with Ari Strandberg-Peshkin, who was a PhD student in my lab and is now just accepted a junior professorship in Konstanz, Damien Farine, who works in the same institute as myself, is a group leader, and Meg Crowfoot, a primatologist from UC Davis. And so what we did was we put GPS and accelerometry collars on all of the individuals, actually 85% of the individuals, within a wild troop of baboons in Kenya. For obvious ethical reasons, we did not put collars on juveniles. And this is the raw data, an example of the raw data. The colors here represent whether it's male, female, or subadults, but that doesn't matter too much for now. And looking at these data, we found tens of thousands of events where some individuals move one way, some individuals move another way, but like the fish, the baboons come to consensus, and these individuals will have to give up. So it's kind of amazing that we could do this with wild primates. And we find that social dominance plays absolutely no role. Whether you're a dominant male versus a subordinate female going one way or the other, it's 50-50. It really plays absolutely no role. So these aggression-related dominance interactions do not translate to influence about group movement. Now, when the group reaches a location, the dominant male can completely dominate the resource. So maybe it's in his interests to allow collective intelligence to decide where to go, because he can, of course, benefit when they go there. We don't know. Or maybe it's just that there are also some uninformed individuals within the group which will spontaneously create these dynamics. But one thing we could do is we could reconstruct these bifurcation diagrams. Now this is the model prediction, and now you see the experimental results in extremely good agreement with the model. So, and of course, these algorithms, they're very simple to run. And they're close to provably optimal. And so even though, of course, these animals are very, very complex in many aspects of their lives, when it comes to movement decisions, we find this model fits extremely well. But of course, these baboons are not moving in an empty environment. They're moving in a complex landscape. And this is actually the landscape from above. This looks like a photograph, but it's not. This is a three-dimensional point cloud taken using drones. So we can image the three-dimensional structure of the environment, including the NDVI, at a resolution of around 3 centimeters. And this is me with the drone, and that's with Ari and Damien in the field. And so it's remarkable, this technology. This is a SenseFly EB drone. You can see every bush. You can even, if we zoom in, you can see the tire tracks in the single-lane roads. You can see the luggers carved out to let water flow. And so, of course, now we can put the animals back into the environment in which they've evolved. You can see here the details. You can see the animal trails, which is something else that we're exploring. So we can now combine this very high-resolution three-dimensional imaging of the environment with the high-resolution movement data of these individuals to see how individuals influence each other and how they also are influenced, and in some cases, influence the environment. We'd love to do this with other species. And Ari, absolutely brilliant scientist, used Bayesian methodology to start putting some of the complexity into these organisms. So we can reconstruct the three-dimensional visual fields to see who could see whom. We don't know which way they're looking, of course, but in principle, if they were looking, they could see another individual. It's not occluded. We could look at the landscape that the individuals had used in the past. We can take into account memory and goals. For example, in the evenings, they want to get back to the sleeping site. We could combine all these factors together. And what we discovered was that in actual fact, the baboons are acting a little bit like ants. They're not really responding to the positions of where the others are. They're responding to where others have been in the last 5 minutes or so, with a decaying function. So one possibility, and it's my favorite plausible hypothesis, is that they're sort of smelling where others go, because they do this even in very dense environments, where they couldn't possibly be seeing all of the other individuals. So they're either looking at where everyone is going and then computing some sort of average, or they're just smelling where others have previously been. And so by taking these quantitative approaches, we can now much, much better predict, using the habitat plus the social environment, predict on an individual by individual basis how, why, and where they're going to move. And so I think we're really in a new era where behavior and ecology are really coming together, and we can conduct these types of experiments in the field. And Martin Wikelski, the co-director of our institute, has developed Icarus. Some of you may know about this system. So this allows cheaper, smaller, lightweight tracking devices to be put on animals. And you don't need to recover the tags because the Soyuz docked with the International Space Station, taking up the first half of this system in October, and in February, the next part is going up. And so the data will be transferred via the International Space Station. So anywhere on the planet, we will be able to get data from animals. And we're planning to make smaller and smaller tags such that we'll even work on insects. I want to look at locust migrations in Africa. We're also very lucky to be working in Germany. It's very rare, a country supporting science in such a way. We just got 32 million euros from the German government to build a new building dedicated to the study of collective behavior, where we're breaking down the barriers by having computer scientists and biologists in the same labs, same offices, working together, developing the next generation of tools and methodologies for understanding complex animal behavior, not just collective behavior, other aspects of behavior. And underneath this building, there's an animal facility, including a 15 by 15 by 8 meter imaging hangar that we're instrumenting for three-dimensional tracking. We've developed all sorts of new 3D tracking technologies. And we want this system and this to be open to anyone in the world. People could come in and utilize this for their own study systems. So if you're interested, please have a chat with me. This will be ready in around 2021. And I'd like to thank you all very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions. We may have to go old school. Looks like technology is failing us.
Well, thank you for a lovely talk. Thank you for that excellent talk. It was very fascinating. I think there's been more than a few minds blown this afternoon, based on what I've been seeing on Twitter. I just have one question for you. You said that uninformed individuals can play a big role in the mixture of uninformed. Is it very common in the real world to have groups of lots of uninformed individuals?
Well, they could be uninformed or they could be unbiased. They could be perfectly well informed but not care which outcome. And so I think being uninformed is very common. So if we look at many of the systems we study, they exist in so-called fission-fusion dynamics. You know, just like us, we each have our own experiences of the world, and when we come together in a group, there are different experiences, right? There's different knowledge. So I think it's very common to have these types of different knowledges together within a group. And of course, the situation could be more complex, because another thing we're exploring is how, you know, by being in a group, you can actually have this sort of wealth of knowledge, these different sources of knowledge that can spontaneously, dynamically come into influence when and where they're needed. So I think there's lots more to look at, but I think it's probably fairly common.
Yeah, and probably due to age maybe as well.
Yeah, there could also be age-related effects. Yeah, for example, in migrations and so forth, there could be age-related effects. And it has been found, you know, sort of anecdotally, that if you fish, trawlers fishing, if they disproportionately take older individuals, this can actually stop the entire migration from occurring. So again, it's suggestive that age and experience play a role via this process of leadership.
We have time for. I don't know, does anyone else need to briefing? Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, as Ecology Across Borders is coming to close, it's up to me. My name is Stefan Hodes. I'm currently serving on the board of JFO as the scientific secretary to say thank you to all of you for having come, and I think all of us, either going home or staying until tomorrow for the post-conference tours, have a lot to think about after Iain's fascinating talk. But yeah, now is, I guess, time for most of us to switch from one collective behavior, a more sedentary state, to a more dynamic state of movement. And we do hope that the collective wisdom of all the means of traffic that you're about to use will not fail you, and that also the stochastic behavior of all the meteorological variables around us will not prevent you from getting where you're headed to. And yeah, so thank you all for having come to Ecology Across Borders, and safe trip home, happy holidays, and see you next time.